Here. I am properly transmitting the slides.
Yes, we can see it all, Anand. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share recommendations about which are the ISO standards that are very critical for information security and for privacy. Some of these standards are evolving. Some of these standards are very new. And is extremely important in terms of the defense of our organizations on how we can support the controls, the action that we take in order to mitigate the risk that you were talking about, the requirement for the GDPR, in a way that we can tell that those controls, those activities, those elements in the framework are based on the international best practices. And this is critical for corporate defense in the way that we can demonstrate compliance when there was a breach, and we need to provide the evidence that the company have done all the due diligence in order to prevent this breach to happen. And it's also extremely important when we also demonstrate compliance to the data controllers when we are processors. In order to address the number of regulations that are based on the accountability principle for companies to prevent breaches, being a professional that is able to navigate through the ISO controls, the elements that they are mentioning in the framework is extremely important. And basically, you will be able to align the design of the controls in policies and procedures in order to support the insurance company requirement when they ask for this documentation, in order to also save money in the cost that you are transferring those risks. Also, one of the elements that we find in practice very important in order to apply the ISO is the way that we can compare our current practices, the current elements of our cybersecurity and privacy programs against the requirement from the ISO, against the best practices, against the principles, against the controls. In practice, we forget many of these things. It's very natural that we are not able to think about some of the elements, some of the practices, some of the control that they are very critical. If you are following the ISO, if you are keeping these standards updated for you in a way that you can do a benchmark and a gap analysis, will allow you to be super sure that whatever that you are building as a due diligence for data processors, as a privacy policy, as a comprehensive information security program is aligned to these standards, and you are not missing any critical element, which in practice is very important. Also, one of the advantages that we have in practice when we are using the ISO in the contracts, in the requirements, in the controls, is that the dialogue with the clients, with the certifiers, is extremely easy. we know what we are talking about because we are using the ISO terms. We know that this requirement and is referenced to this control with this number, that there is plenty of biographies, plenty of references that we can use to apply to whatever that is the circumstance. For instance, using the records and the risk assessment for the ROPA, that finally it improves the communication and the expectations on what it should be done. So it's critical for us that we follow this ISO approach that is also based on continuous improvement. It's collecting the views from experts all around the world. It's building up consensus and knowledge through many years in the way that finally is benefiting your organization and your career. So the first ISO that I recommend you to focus is the 27002. And this ISO is going to provide you the 114 cyber controls that is referenced also to the last ISO 27001 that you can use for a lot of activities. You can use them for contractual clauses, you can use them for due diligence, you can use them for auditing, and basically they will allow to simplify the way that we tie the risks in the DPAs, in the privacy program against the control. So you got the control that is there focus on the description, the objective that you can use as a reference. And then what you're going to do is to describe this control in your organization. That is a very easy way that you can take advantage from the ISO 27002. There is a lot of details. It explains all these controls, but there is one thing. We are talking here about cyber controls to protect the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of data. We are not talking here about personal data in particular. So the ISO recognized this need for the professional to focus the comprehensive controls in cybersecurity to privacy. So that's why last year we have, after a lot of work, a new ISO, the 27601, that is tailoring, is focusing these comprehensive data security controls for personal data. So basically, this ISO is giving you 31 controls that you can apply only for personal information and GDPR. This ISO is very important in terms that also the articles and the recitals of GDPR are linked to the ISO controls. It helps also internally in the organization in order to positionate the DPO office with the information security department, with compliance. So basically, you can use the ISO to align, for instance, for a compliance management system, the ISO 27001.
Así que por la compu voy a mirar y ahora tengo una reunión Zoom que la voy a hacer por el...
Thank you. So it's very important that you are following this ISO when you are working with a GDPR implementation or maintenance of a program. Because there is little to add. There is a lot to adjust to your organization. There is a lot of to deploy, but you can start from controls that are well explained, and they have a lot of reference in our books. Then there is another ISO that is very important, the ISO on the privacy frameworks, the 29100, that it will give you good principles and roadmaps and roles for implementing a privacy program in general. It's not focused on GDPR in particular, but any regulation, any privacy program will cover the high-end processes related to GDPR. All the regulations and requirements are based on data protection, are based on rights, are based on identifying assets, identifying the way that the assets as personal data is received, processed, and then finally transmitted and destroyed. And the way that you need to deploy a crisis protocol to respond to a data breach, for instance, and how are you planning? And then you can tailor this ISO to the GDPR requirements. But they are not so important. They are basically details about how much time you got, how much people you need to involve when there is a breach, those type of circumstances. However, you are not missing anything important if you are following the ISO. Another ISO that I want you to explore, to use, and to check the importance for your organization is the ISO on business continuity, the 22601. This ISO will help you to prepare, to avoid, and to respond to any event that is finally going to interrupt the operation. So it's very critical that your crisis protocol for data breach and the way that you are ensuring the integrity of interfaces and the system availability, that is also critical for GDPR, is based on this ISO. Because finally, it will improve the capabilities of the organization to respond and to be stronger when there is, for instance, an incident that we need to restore information very fast, or we need to deal with a huge demand of subject access requests. The ISO allows you to have this comprehensive view about all these events that will trigger a non-compliance for GDPR or any privacy regulation. Also, I want to recommend the ISO on privacy impact assessments. When we had the DPA request for GDPR, and it was not a new thing in IT, in information security. We had been performing data protection agreement assessments from the beginning of time in IT risk management. We have a lot of references and a lot of knowledge. ISO recognized that all this knowledge needed to be part of an ISO, and finally provided the ISO 29134 in order to get all the elements for producing a privacy impact assessment, and more important, what to do when you are identifying risk in IT processes, in projects, in plans, in controls, in outsourcing activities, that you need to do something. So the ISO will allow you to have the best practices in order to have the dynamic part of a data processing, the data privacy impact assessment. Because at least in my experience, the best risk here, the main risk here in the DPAs is that they are done as a bureaucracy for justifying the blueprint and the process plans and the development request that it was already done. So the participants for these exercises are seeing only bureaucracy. So the ISO will definitely help us to have this dynamic approach to the DPAs. And finally, there is an ISO that is basically missed in the radar of many privacy specialists. We have an ISO that will help you in the way that you identify opportunities to deal with cybersecurity policies, insurance. It's incredible that we are always talking about risks and controls, and we are missing a big part of the strategies that we are using in risk management related to transferring risks. And this is a discussion that we need to cover. There is now much more insurance companies offering coverage for GDPR non-compliances, for damages, for in the way that we can diminish the impact. The ISO, this ISO, the 27102, will support that decision. It will identify opportunities to get the insurance in cybersecurity, depending on the type of incidents, depending on what is available in your country, and also how you need to consider the cost. Finally, I want to reflect on how important the ISO are for your organization, but also for your career. If you're following the ISO principles, what you are building is making you a better professional in a way that you can get a client talking with a common terminology. You can go to a job interview talking about best practices, and not something that you needed to invent overnight, or you heard that a guru was saying that something was working and then you followed that, and finally it was not impacting your organization. The ISO principles and controls have this approach that are able to be a plug and play in most of the organizations. It's one of the things that I like for the Information Security Institute and the E Academy, in the way that is based on the ISO with this comprehensive approach that definitely will impact all the aspects of information security, all the cycles in your organization, and more important, it will support your career. When you have that job interview, it's extremely different to say that you were building a privacy program on an ad hoc analysis or a customized risk assessment or a roadmap that you took from a consultancy firm, rather than saying that is coming from ideas as the one that the GDPR Institute and the E-Compliance Academy are sharing, talking about look at the ISO, this is the way that you can articulate, and this is very comprehensive. You can tailor, but you don't need to start from scratch. So I think that I can give the mic back to Kelsey
Okay, thank you very much, Hernan. Once again, you have provided us with extremely relevant insights on the practical component. And this is so good about your presentations. We can use your speech, your guidance, your slides as a checklist in order to figure out what are the different steps we need to take, what are the areas that we need to focus on, what are the risk components that are an area that can create the basis, the platform, the framework, and provide with the roadmap for using ISO as a vital component for one or many of the compliance activities. There is a couple of questions as far as I can see. I don't know.
This Muhammad Kamran had a question. He can unmute his microphone and ask if he wants.
Muhammad Kamran, could you please unmute your microphone and ask your question to Anand?
You're on.
Yes, we can hear you.
It's a great presentation on the ISO frameworks and the standards and controls. My question is, there are a lot of frameworks like NIST cybersecurity framework, ISO cybersecurity framework 27032. Which one framework to follow? How we decide which framework to follow? Either we implement the NIST cybersecurity framework, we go for the ISO 27001 in relation with ISO 27002. Can you put some brief highlight on this thing?
Thank you, Mohammed. I think that I have not any day that somebody is arguing about what is best. Nest of ISO, we should go first and not. We need to avoid this type of disputes or references as you are a fan of a soccer club or the other soccer club. For me, what is important is the number of controls that the organization is able to deploy. Next, when we are talking about the 800 guidelines with the 53 version 4, that is the last one, the controls are very detailed, that it may be very hard to implement in a DPO office. There are so many controls that they are so detailed. They follow this bottom-up approach that I find them very granular for dealing in a privacy program, for dealing in a due diligence for the data processor, for dealing with them in an audit. Personally, because of the granularity, the level of aggregation of the controls, I prefer to go for ISO. Anyway, I can translate. There are a lot of translation between ISO and NIST. They are asking for the same thing. The only thing that is different is how deep they describe each of these controls. So, Mohammed, it really depends on your preference and what is the organization able to digest. Maybe you need to start from the top down with the ISO approach, very high level controls, and then going deeper when you have the capabilities. Anyway, we are focusing on the same regulation. We have common goals. So it's not that if you are choosing ISO, you cannot go for NIST, or if you are a NIST person, you cannot be an ISO person. Basically, as in life, when we are getting older, all the positions are in grays. So there is not a black and white positions. Definitely, this is my advice for you in practice, Don't be a Taliban for one of these framework and trying to say that the other one is not working. And we need to be very flexible and say, okay, maybe I am a Nest person. I like to go to the details, but my organization cannot articulate that. I cannot have such a long due diligence process or a long audit. So what for, basically? So this is my personal advice. I don't think that Nest or ISO are different. You can reconcile all of them at the end of the day for privacy. Don't worry about that. It's just a level of aggregation.
So thank you very much, Hernan. We can choose one or the other depending on the maturity of the organization, the size of the organization, the culture of the organization, the experience in using these standards, whether it's NIST or ISO or some other. But the main point, at least in my opinion, is to find some of the components, because there are many components in ISO or also in NIST that you will not use in your organization. And when you are going through this exercise, you will select, you will scope, as we talked about in the steps earlier. And whilst you are using the scoping component, whilst you are customizing your preferences on what is more relevant, more important at this particular stage, you might as well just use those few components from the ISO or any other standard and customize it to be as your own framework, and then use some others for step 2 or step 3 or year 2 or year 3 and so on. So it's a journey, and right from the beginning, try to customize it, because very few organizations, extremely few organizations need all of the areas, all of the documentation that is required in either the ISO or the NIST or any other framework. Thank you very much, Hernan. Maybe you can be here until the end or join us later on. So we will now continue for the next session, which is Chris.